What would you choose? Eat a piece of bread to survive one more day, or give it up to mold hope for a friend? In the hell known as a prisoner of war camp, Julian made his choice. He starved for 3 days, turning his meager rations into a rosary. The guards laughed at him. The other prisoners thought he had lost his mind. But when a German officer raised his boot to crush this sacrifice into the mud, something happened that silenced the entire barracks. This is not just a story about a miracle. This is a story about how bread given to another can feed the soul of even the cruelest executioner. You know, the kind of cold that doesn't just touch your skin, but gets inside you. A cold that settles in your bones and refuses to leave, no matter how many layers you wear. At Stalag 312, lost somewhere in the snow on the border of Poland and Germany, this cold was a permanent roommate. It was the winter of 1944. The air smelled of two things: coal smoke and unwashed bodies. All around was gray snow, the barking of shepherd dogs, and barbed wire humming in the wind like an angry string. Julian sat on the bottom bunk, hugging his knees. He was 32 years old. Before the war, he lived in Cincinnati, Ohio. Just a regular guy, a carpenter. He had big, calloused hands that used to smell of wood shavings and varnish. Hands that built porches, fixed fences, swung nephews. Now those hands looked like bird claws, skin and bone. The dirt was ingrained so deep into the lines of his palms, it looked like a tattoo. "Julian," a voice wheezed from above. It was weak and wet. It was Tommy, a 19-year-old kid from Iowa. Just 3 months ago, Tommy joked that he went to war to impress the girl next door. Now Tommy was dying. Pneumonia was eating his lungs. He burned with fever even as he shivered from the cold. Julian stood up. Every movement required effort. Hunger sucked energy like a parasite. He said, "I am here, Tommy. I am here." Tommy looked at him with wide, glassy eyes full of terror. Have you ever seen the eyes of a person who knows they are leaving but isn't ready? He asked if his mother was coming, if she had baked the rhubarb pie. He was delirious. Julian lied and said she was coming, tucking the thin, reeking blanket around him. Julian sank back onto the bunk. His stomach twisted in a spasm. The emptiness inside was a physical pain, sharp and pulsing. He hadn't eaten anything solid for 2 days. The door of the barracks crashed open. An icy wind rushed in, followed by the shout of a guard. "Rations! Move it, rats!" The shadows peeled themselves off the walls. Men who were once bankers, farmers, and teachers now shoved like animals, holding out tin bowls. Julian got in line. The distribution was fast. A ladle of slop, cloudy water with a few potato peels, and the bread ersatz brought. A mixture of rye flour, potato, and sawdust. A heavy, damp, dark brick. Julian received his piece. It was barely larger than a matchbox. The smell was sour, but to a starving man, it was the smell of life. His mouth flooded with saliva. Instinct screamed at him to eat it, to swallow it immediately. He brought the bread to his mouth. His teeth touched the crust. He looked at Tommy, thrashing in delirium on the bunk. Tommy was gripping the edge of the blanket, his fingers searching frantically for something to hold on to. He had nothing to hold on to in this world. Julian closed his eyes. He took a deep breath, and he stopped. He bit off half the ration. He swallowed it, barely chewing, feeling the sawdust scratch his throat. But the second half, he did not eat. He sat in the corner where the shadows were deepest. He checked for guards. Julian placed the soft inner bread on his palm. It was damp and sticky. He began to roll it, slowly, methodically. He rolled the bread into a small, tight ball. The saliva and dirt from his fingers served as glue. The bread turned gray, hard, almost like stone. The neighbor to his left, an old sergeant named Miller, noticed. He hissed, asking what Julian was doing, telling him to eat before it was taken. Julian didn't answer. He kept rolling. One bead. Small, imperfect, made of hunger and dirt. Julian hid it under the mattress, where a piece of torn thread pulled from his uniform already lay. There were already 3 such balls there. He was making a rosary. Each bead cost him calories that could have extended his life by an hour. But he knew Tommy wouldn't last the week, and Tommy needed something to hold, not a spoon, not a blanket. He needed an anchor, so he wouldn't be so afraid of the dark. Julian felt dizziness wash over him. He had sacrificed dinner for one Hail Mary. Suddenly, dogs barked outside, loud, aggressive voices, the sound of boots on frozen ground approaching the barracks. The door hit the wall with such force it seemed the hinges would fly off. Attention! Everyone stand. He entered. Oberleutnant Vogel. The prisoners called him the Butcher, not because he shouted, but because of how quietly he spoke before hurting someone. Vogel walked slowly down the aisle, tapping a riding crop against his thigh. His eyes, cold and blue, scanned the rows like a gun sight. He stopped right in front of Julian. He looked at his hands, at the crumbs on his uniform. Then he shifted his gaze to the mattress, where 4 bread balls lay hidden. Vogel smiled. It was a smile with nothing human in it. He said quietly that tomorrow there would be a total purge. They would find everything the rats were hiding. He turned and left. Julian felt his heart drop. Tomorrow they would overturn everything. They would find the bread. And for wasting German property in Stalag 312, there was only one punishment. Night in Barracks 9 was never quiet. It was a chorus of broken men, coughs that sounded like barking, moans of those dreaming of food. The whisper of prayers in 10 different languages, and the sound of the wind seeking cracks in the rotten boards, as if wanting to climb inside and kill those the hunger hadn't finished off. Julian didn't sleep. He sat cross-legged in the dark, diluted only by the dim, dying light of a single bulb in the hallway. In his hands was bread, remnants of yesterday's ration. Another tiny piece from today's. His stomach cramped so hard Julian doubled over. His body screamed at him to eat, that he was dying. He closed his eyes and saw Union Station in Cincinnati. 1942, rain drumming on the platform roof. Steam from the locomotive, the smell of wet wool and cheap cigarettes. A woman in a gray coat squeezing his hand so hard her knuckles turned white. Mrs. Richardson, Tommy's mother. She told him Tommy was just a boy who had never been past his grandmother's farm. She made him promise. Julian promised to look after him, to bring him home. She whispered not to just bring him back, but not to let him lose himself. Julian opened his eyes. Reality hit with the smell of mold. Tommy lay nearby, breathing heavily. The fever was burning him. He mumbled something about baseball and iced lemonade. He was already losing himself. The fear of death was taking his mind faster than the pneumonia. Julian looked at the bread. He pinched off a piece, put it in his mouth. But he didn't swallow. He held it on his tongue, letting saliva soften the stale crumb mixed with sawdust. The taste was sour, earthy. Then he spat the viscous mass into his palm. It was disgusting. It was unhygienic, and it was the only building material he had. He began to roll, slowly, circular motions with his thumb. Saliva worked as glue. Dirt from his unwashed hands mixed with the bread, turning it into dark gray, almost black clay. When the mass began to dry, it became hard as a pebble. The 5th bead. Julian threaded it onto the string pulled from the hem of his robe. The thread was coarse but strong. Sergeant Miller spoke from the darkness to his left. He told Julian he was going to die, that he was wasting calories to mold balls out of filth and bread, that it was insanity. Julian didn't stop. He started the 6th bead. He told the sergeant that Tommy was dying. Miller hissed back that they were all dying, pointing out Julian's ribs sticking out like a skeleton in anatomy class. Julian looked at Miller. He said Tommy was afraid, that he cried every night not from pain, but from the fear that there was nothing in the dark, that he was alone. Julian held up the string with 5 homely, ugly gray beads. In the dim light, they looked pathetic. Trash. He said Tommy needed something to hold, an anchor, that if he gave him this, maybe he wouldn't be so afraid to go. Miller was silent for a long minute. Then he sighed heavily, turning his back. He called Julian a holy fool and said Vogel would kill him for it tomorrow. Vogel. The name hung in the air like an axe. Julian knew Miller was right. Hoarding food was forbidden. Wasting rations was forbidden. Religious symbols not approved by the administration were forbidden. If the butcher found this, he wouldn't just take the rosary. He would force Julian to eat it, then beat him to death on the parade ground as a lesson to others. But Julian kept rolling. 6th bead, 7th. His fingers ached. His stomach howled. His head spun from hunger so hard the barracks walls seemed to breathe. But with every bead he felt something strange, calm, as if he wasn't building just a rosary but a ladder. By dawn he had 10 beads, 1 decade, and a small crooked cross molded from the crust. He put the finished piece on the windowsill where the draft was strongest so the bread would harden completely. Then the siren wailed. A sharp, piercing howl that meant wake up, but today it sounded different, longer, more demanding. Doors flew open all over the camp. The dogs barked louder. Everyone out, fast. Julian grabbed the still damp rosary. It was hard on the outside, but soft on the inside. Where to put it? Pocket? They'd find it. Mouth? Can't speak? Boot? Crushed. Tommy groaned, waking up from the noise. Julian leaned over him. He told Tommy to listen carefully. He placed the gray string of beads into the boy's hot, sweaty palm. Tommy's fingers instinctively closed. Julian told him to hide it in his fist, not to open his hand no matter what happened. A figure appeared in the doorway, tall peaked cap, perfectly polished boots, a riding crop in a gloved hand. Oberleutnant Vogel. Behind him stood 3 soldiers with rifles ready. Vogel walked slowly into the barracks, inhaling the stale air as if tasting wine. He wished the ladies a good morning and hoped they slept well. He struck the nearest bunk with his crop. He announced they were going to turn the place upside down. The soldiers moved forward, tearing mattresses from the bunks. Have you ever heard what destruction sounds like? Not a bomb explosion, not a falling building, but small, personal destruction. The rip of fabric, the crash of a broken cup, the crunch of wood broken by a boot. That morning, Barracks 9 was filled with this symphony of chaos. Soldiers worked not like men, but like machines. They tore threadbare blankets from bunks, shaking contents onto the filthy floor. Spoons, rags, letters read to holes, everything that made up the prisoner's pitiful world flew into the dirt. Julian stood by the wall, hands behind his head. Tremors shook his body, not from cold, but from terror. His gaze was fixed on the corner where Tommy lay on the bottom bunk. The boy hadn't been kicked out only because he couldn't stand. He lay curled in a ball, wheezing heavily. His right hand was clenched into a fist, knuckles white. He held the bread rosary as if it were his mother's hand. Oberleutnant Vogel stood in the center of the aisle, watching. He didn't participate in the mayhem, he conducted it. His blue eyes slid over faces, looking for fear, looking for guilt. A soldier shouted that it was clear. Another kicked Sergeant Miller's empty duffel bag. Vogel nodded slowly. He tapped his crop against the shaft of his perfectly polished boot. Tap, 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 the rhythm of approaching disaster. He turned to Julian. He called him the carpenter. Julian didn't lower his eyes. It was dangerous, but he couldn't look away. Vogel said he saw Julian hiding his hands yesterday. He asked what was there. He walked up close. He smelled of expensive tobacco and mint aftershave, the scent of civilization in the middle of barbarism. He patted Julian's pockets. Empty. Ran a hand down his sides, only ribs protruding through thin fabric. Vogel frowned. He knew there was something. His predator instinct never failed. His gaze slid to the side, to the bunks, to Tommy. The boy groaned in his sleep, his body jerking in fever, and in that moment his fist relaxed slightly. Just a little. But it was enough. Vogel saw the gray thread hanging between the fingers. The smile that appeared on the officer's face was scarier than any scream. He exhaled, saying, "Ah, there it is." He stepped toward the bunk. Julian lunged forward, shouting not to touch him. A rifle butt to the back knocked him down. Julian fell to his knees, gasping for air, but kept watching. Vogel leaned over Tommy. With disgust, as if touching a dead rat, he took the boy's thin wrist with two gloved fingers. Tommy tried to squeeze his hand, instinctively protecting his treasure. But what could a dying teenager do against a grown man? Vogel squeezed the wrist harder. Joints cracked. Tommy cried out and his fingers opened. Onto the dirty, trampled floor of the barracks fell the object. Not gold, not a weapon, not an escape map. 10 gray, crooked, ugly balls on a string, and a small, shapeless cross. Vogel stared at the find. For a second he looked puzzled. He leaned down, picked up the rosary with the tip of his crop, hooking it by the string, and lifted it to eye level. The beads dangled in the air, pathetic and insignificant. He whispered the word bread. His voice held genuine confusion turning into rage. He turned to Julian, still on his knees. He asked if Julian stole Reich rations to mold toys. Julian wheezed, spitting blood, that it was not a toy. It was a rosary. For prayer. Silence hung in the barracks. Even the soldiers froze. Religion was opium, weakness. But to waste food on it? That was a crime against the logic of survival. Vogel's face darkened. He asked if Julian thought his God saw this place, if he cared about a pile of dirt and bread. Vogel slapped the rosary off the crop and threw it to the floor. Right into a puddle of melting snow and filth dripped from soldiers' boots. The gray beads, which had absorbed so much hope and hunger, now lay in sewage. Vogel barked that there was no God in this camp, only discipline. He raised his foot. A heavy black army boot, hobnailed with steel, a sole that had trampled Europe, a sole designed to crush. Julian screamed for him not to do it. He tried to get up, but a soldier hit him again, pressing his face to the floor. Julian could see everything from ground level, like in slow motion. Vogel's boot hovered over the bread rosary, over the labor of 3 sleepless nights, over Tommy's last anchor. It was the end. One strike of the heel and the bread would turn into wet mush mixed with mud. Hope would be crushed as easily as that crumb. Vogel shifted his weight to his standing leg. His thigh muscles tensed for the strike. The boot began to descend, sharp, merciless. Julian shut his eyes. He didn't want to see Faith die. The boot stopped, not because Vogel changed his mind, and not because someone pushed him. It stopped as if it hit an invisible wall of armored glass. 2 centimeters from the dirty floor, silence hung in the barracks, the kind that only exists after an explosion, ringing, absolute. Julian, lying on the floor with a split lip, looked at the toe of the black boot. He saw the officer's leg trembling. Vogel's thigh muscles strained. He was pushing. He was trying to lower his leg to finish what he started. But the air under his sole had become harder than stone. And then it happened. At first, Julian thought he was hallucinating from the blow to his head, the smell. Barracks 9 always smelled the same: urine, rotting straw, sweat, and death. It was a smell that ingrained itself into skin and wouldn't wash off for years. But suddenly, in 1 second, that stench vanished. It wasn't just overpowered by something else, it was displaced. As if someone had opened a window not into winter Poland, but into a summer garden in the height of July. Roses, the sweet, thick, almost physically dense aroma of fresh roses. Not the smell of cheap perfume, not the smell of soap, but the smell of a living flower, warmed by the sun, its petals just opening. Vogel staggered. He jerked his foot back as if he had stepped on hot coals. He took a step back, grabbing his throat, and began to gasp for air. His face, red with anger a second ago, turned white as chalk. One of the guards lowered his rifle, sniffing the air like a hound that lost the scent, and asked the Oberleutnant if he felt it. Vogel didn't answer. He couldn't. He looked at the dirty floor, at the small pile of gray bread lying in the puddle. The smell was coming from there, in waves, pulsing, filling every corner of the freezing barracks with a warmth that shouldn't exist there. It was impossible. It was 20 degrees below zero outside. The ground was frozen a meter deep. There wasn't a living flower within 100 kilometers, but the barracks smelled as if a dump truck of petals had been emptied there. Julian slowly raised his head. He inhaled. The aroma was so strong, tears came to his eyes. It wasn't just the smell of flowers, it was the smell of home, the smell of safety, the smell of life. Tommy ceased thrashing on the bunk. His breathing evened out. He lay with eyes closed, smiling in his sleep, breathing deeply of this impossible air. The shepherd dog at the door whined. It cowered, tucked its tail, and crawled backward out the door, covering its nose with its paws. Animals sense the presence of what is beyond their understanding faster than humans. Vogel slowly removed a leather glove. His hand, the very hand that had signed hundreds of death warrants, was shaking, violently, uncontrollably. He sank to his knees, right into the mud, in his perfect pressed trousers. He didn't take his eyes off the bread rosary. There was no cruelty left in his eyes. There was a primal, animal terror. The terror of a man who believed all his life he was the supreme power, suddenly colliding with someone who could change the laws of physics with a snap of fingers. He reached out. Julian wanted to scream, to stop him, but his voice was gone. Vogel's fingers touched the gray bead. Did the officer expect it to burn him or crumble? But it was just bread, hard, dry bread. And yet, when he took the rosary in his hand, the scent multiplied tenfold. It became so concentrated the soldiers felt dizzy. Vogel brought the bread beads to his face. He inhaled, and Julian saw a single tear roll down the butcher's cheek. It traced a path on his pale skin. What did he see in that moment? His mother's garden in Dresden before it was bombed? His childhood? Or the abyss of his own soul illuminated by this sudden light? Vogel closed his eyes. His shoulders slumped. His entire menacing posture, his armor of Nazi ideology, crumbled like sand. He sat on his knees in the mud, in the middle of a death camp, pressing bread balls, molded by a prisoner, to his face. A minute passed, an eternity. No one dared to move. Then Vogel opened his eyes. There was emptiness in them, and a strange, frightening clarity. He slowly turned to the bunk where Tommy lay. He didn't throw the rosary. He didn't crush it. With incredible care, as if holding crystal, Vogel placed the bread beads back into the boy's open palm. He closed Tommy's fingers around them. He whispered in a hoarse, alien voice to keep it. He struggled to stand up. He swayed. He looked at Julian. The officer's gaze was long. There was no forgiveness in it. No. There was a request. The silent plea of a drowning man. He whispered to the soldiers to get out. They didn't move, stunned. Then Vogel screamed, his voice breaking into a shriek, ordering them out. The soldiers backed toward the exit, stumbling, dragging the whining dog. Vogel cast one last look at the bread in Tommy's hand. He turned sharply and practically ran out of the barracks, slamming the door so hard dust fell from the ceiling. The door closed, but the scent remained. It hung in the air, soaking into the wood, the clothes, and the souls of 40 men who had just seen God stop an executioner's boot. Julian collapsed on the floor, covering his face with his hands. He sobbed, without sound. For the first time in 3 years, he wasn't crying from grief. Night fell on Stalag 312, but the darkness no longer seemed so dense. In Barracks 9, no one slept. 40 men lay on bunks with eyes open, listening to the silence. Usually the night was filled with moans, coughs, and rats scurrying. Today there was silence, like in a cathedral after Mass, and the smell. It had become fainter, thinner, but hadn't disappeared. The scent of roses was ingrained in the rotten floorboards, the frozen walls, the old rags. It hung in the air like an invisible shield. Julian sat at Tommy's bedside. The boy's fever had broken. For the first time in a week, his breathing was even and deep without the terrifying wheeze. In his hand, even in sleep, Tommy tightly gripped the gray string of beads. Now it was the most guarded treasure in Europe. Around 2 a.m, the door creaked. Every head turned instantly. No shout of Achtung, no stomping guard boots, no dogs. One man stood in the doorway, a silhouette in a long greatcoat. Cap pulled low over his eyes. Oberleutnant Vogel. He entered and quietly bolted the door behind him. It was madness. A German officer entering a prisoner barracks at night without a weapon or guard? He could be strangled in a second, torn apart with bare hands, but no one moved. Vogel looked different. His perfect posture was gone, shoulders hunched. In the darkness, sweat glistened on his forehead, despite it being 20 below zero outside. He walked to Julian's bunk. His steps were soft, uncertain. He stopped and looked at the sleeping Tommy, then shifted his gaze to Julian. He asked how. One word. Hoarse like a shard of glass in his throat. He asked how the carpenter did it. What chemistry? What trick? He was still trying to find a rational explanation. His German brain, raised on order and logic, demanded facts. Julian rose slowly. He was a head shorter than the officer, but now they seemed equal. He said there were no tricks, that he just mixed bread with dirt. Julian showed his empty, dirty palms. He said he molded, and she did the rest. Vogel flinched as if shocked. He whispered the word, she. He looked around as if expecting to see a woman in the corner of the barracks. He stammered that his mother grew them, yellow tea roses, the whole garden. His voice broke. Vogel took a shuddering breath and unbuttoned the top of his greatcoat. He pulled out a package wrapped in oiled paper. He held it out to Julian. The officer's hands were shaking. He ordered him in a whisper to take it. Julian hesitated. Vogel hissed for him to take it. Julian took the package. It was heavy and warm from the officer's body. He unwrapped the paper. The smell of roses mixed with another smell that made Julian dizzy. Real bread. White, dense, smelling of yeast. A piece of hard cheese and a small glass jar with white pills. Sulfonamide, Vogel said without looking him in the eye, that it was for the boy. 2 pills now, 2 in the morning. From the darkness, other prisoners began to draw closer. Sergeant Miller limped forward. They looked at the food like a mirage. Miller asked why, his voice full of suspicion. Was it poisoned? Was it a game? Vogel chuckled bitterly. He said the game was over. He took off his cap and ran a hand through his hair. For the first time, they saw him without headgear. He looked tired, aged 10 years in one day. He said quietly that he received a telegram from Berlin at 18 Schquai. Liquidation, a complete cleaning of the camp. It became so quiet in the barracks you could hear the electric bulb buzzing. Vogel continued that Soviet troops were 50 kilometers away. The order was clear: leave no witnesses, burn the barracks, prisoners into the ditch. Julian asked when. His lips were dry. Vogel said 3 days. They had 3 days. Vogel looked at his hands. The very hands that were supposed to sign the execution order. He whispered that he couldn't, that after this morning he couldn't be part of it anymore. He felt that smell. He knew he was watching. He looked up at Julian. There was the resolve of a condemned man in his eyes. He said if they stayed, they would die, every single one. That he couldn't stop the SS when they arrived with the Sonderkommando. He paused, scanning the gaunt faces around him. He told them they wouldn't stay. Vogel reached into the inner pocket of his tunic and pulled out a folded map. He spread it on sleeping Tommy's knees, right next to the bread rosary. He said he had a truck and a route, but they needed to pass 2 checkpoints. Julian looked at the map, then at the bread in his hands, then at the Wehrmacht officer planning high treason. The world had flipped. The enemy brought bread. The executioner offered salvation. And it all started with a handful of crumbs. Julian told the Oberleutnant there were 40 of them. How would they fit in one truck? Vogel looked at him hard, soldier-like. He said, like herring in a barrel. If they wanted to live. The map spread on the knees was old, edges frayed, folds worn to holes. In the dim bulb light, the red road lines looked like veins. Vogel traced the paper with his finger. His fingernail was manicured, clean, a sharp contrast to the dirty hands of the prisoners leaning over him. He tapped a point. Checkpoint North. Young ones from the Hitler Youth. Fanatics, but idiots. Passable. He drew the line further south. Then the bridge over the Oder River. That was the problem. Vogel looked up. His face was gray with fatigue. He said the SS were there. The Totenkopf Division. They didn't ask questions. They shot first. Sergeant Miller spat on the floor. He told Vogel he was leading them to slaughter. 1 truck? 40 people? They'd be stopped at the first turn. He called it a delivery of targets to a shooting range. Murmurs rose in the barracks. The fear of death that had momentarily receded at the sight of food returned with new force. Men began to whisper, "It's a trap. He wants to kill us in the woods. Better to die here than in a truck." Vogel didn't argue. He took out a cigarette, tapped it on his case, but didn't light it. He remembered where he was. He told the sergeant quietly that if he wanted to kill them, he didn't need to take them anywhere. He could just open the door and whistle for the dogs, or wait 3 days for the flamethrowers. He put the unlit cigarette back. He said he wasn't doing this for them. He was doing it for himself, because he didn't want to burn in hell for what he saw today. Julian was silent. He held the piece of real bread the officer brought. The crumb was springy. The crust smelled of the oven. He broke off a small piece. He said they would go. Miller turned sharply. He asked if Julian was delirious from hunger to trust a Nazi. Julian nodded at Tommy. The boy slept. His chest rose and fell calmly. A pink tint was returning to his cheeks, replacing the deathly pallor. He gripped the bread rosary in his fist as if it were a life-preserver. Julian told the sergeant to look at him. Yesterday they thought they'd be carrying his corpse out. Now he slept. The rosary saved him. The same power that stopped Vogel's boot would lead them out. Julian held up the piece of bread crust in his hand. Bread brought by the enemy. He told the Oberleutnant he didn't have the last bead. He needed material for the cross. Vogel looked at the bread. A bitter smirk touched his lips. He called it ironic. German bread for their God. Julian began to work. Right there during the war council, he kneaded the crust with his fingers, mixing it with crumbs of the old ersatz bread, old and new, suffering and hope. He molded a cross, not simple, but a rough, sturdy cross to complete the chain. While he worked, Vogel continued the briefing. The truck was an Opel Blitz, old tarp, with holes. It would be cold. But that was good. No thermal imagers, and no one liked checking under freezing canvas. They would leave at 03 hour, shift change. He forged documents for garbage removal. If asked, they were transporting old uniforms for disinfection. The stench in the back would play into their hands. Someone asked, what if they wanted to check? Vogel looked at his watch. He said then he would die first, and they would die right after him. Julian finished. He attached the bread cross to the string. The rosary was complete, full circle. He placed it in Tommy's hand, closing the boy's fingers over the cross. He said they were ready. The next hour passed in feverish preparation. There was nothing to pack. People had no belongings. They packed themselves, wrapped feet in rags, shared leftover cheese, prayed. At 02:55, an engine roared behind the wall, heavy diesel sound. The barracks door opened. The blizzard outside intensified. Snow flew horizontally, hiding the world in a white veil. It was a blessing. Snow would hide tracks. Snow would muffle sound. Vogel commanded them to move fast, like ghosts. Not a sound. 40 shadows slipped out of the barracks. The truck stood in the blind spot of the watchtower searchlight. Vogel knew the light's rotation schedule to the second. They climbed into the back silently. The crowding was immense. Men had to stand tight against each other, limbs interlaced to fit everyone. Julian climbed in last, pulling the half-asleep Tommy. He seated the boy in the center, where it was warmest from the men's bodies. Vogel fastened the tarp from the outside. It became dark, absolute blackness, and the smell of 40 unwashed bodies mixed with diesel. But in the center of that darkness, in Tommy's hand, was another smell, faint now, but there. Roses. The cab door slammed, the engine revved, and the truck jerked. They moved, slowly at first rolling over ruts, then faster. Julian pressed his ear to the cold side. He heard snow crunching under tires. They approached the camp gates. The first hurdle. The truck braked. Voices outside. German, laughter. Julian's heart beat so loud he thought it would wake the guards. Someone nearby started whispering the Lord's Prayer. Julian covered his mouth with a hand. Silence. A voice outside told Vogel to pass and not forget to bring schnapps. The gates creaked. The truck moved. They were outside the perimeter, first step taken, but ahead was the bridge over the Oder and the SS. In the darkness of the truck bed, Tommy suddenly opened his eyes. He whispered, asking why it smelled of flowers. Julian smiled in the dark. He told the kid to sleep. They were going home. The road was not a road. It was a washboard of ice and mud. Inside the truck bed, 40 men swayed as a single organism. The darkness was absolute. Cold penetrated through gaps in the tarp, biting faces and hands, creeping under thin robes. But no one complained. No one made a sound. Fear was stronger than cold. Julian stood in the center, holding Tommy. The boy was hot, but it was the warmth of life, not fever. In Tommy's clenched fist, something else pulsed, invisible heat. The smell of roses in the back was fainter, but still there. A thin trail calming nerves stretched like wires. The truck braked sharply. Inertia threw the men forward. They hit each other softly, silently, trained by years of camp life to be quieter than shadows. A sharp, barking voice sounded outside, not regular Wehrmacht. It was that accent, imperious, smug, SS. Halt. Cut the engine. Julian's heart skipped a beat. They were at the bridge over the Oder. The last line before the forest, before freedom. He heard the cab door slam. Vogel's heavy steps on gravel. Vogel announced himself as Oberleutnant Vogel, 312th Guard Battalion. His voice sounded firm, but Julian heard notes an outsider wouldn't notice. Fear. A second voice asked where he was heading at this hour. It was young, too young, and full of that dangerous boredom that makes people seek entertainment in others' pain. Vogel replied, special cargo. Stinking rags, uniforms from the typhus barracks, taking them to the quarry for burning. It was the lie they invented. Typhus scared Germans more than Russian tanks. A pause hung. Julian stopped breathing. 40 men in the back turned into statues. Only the wind whistle and old Tarp Creek were audible. The SS officer asked, "Typhus, you say?" The sound of walking around the truck was audible. Crunch of snow under boots. He approached the tailgate, right where they stood behind a thin layer of fabric. Julian saw the fabric bow inward. Someone poked it with a machine gun barrel. The voice spoke right by Julian's ear, separated by a millimeter of canvas, saying it was strange. Usually special commandos were called for that during the day. Vogel barked that it was the commandant's order. He tried to press with authority. He challenged the Scharführer to call and wake him, but warned he would say who held him up. It was a risk. A bluff on the edge. Silence again. Finally, the SS officer said not to bother the Standartenführer. Julian began to exhale, but the officer said he was obligated to check the cargo. Regulations. Blood drained from Julian's face. He felt Tommy's hand squeeze his elbow. The boy's fingers dug into the fabric. He whispered Julian's name. Outside, fasteners rattled. The sharp sound of leather unbuckling. 1, 2, the command for light. The tailgate crashed down. The tarp flap flew up. A bright, blinding beam of a powerful flashlight cut the darkness of the truck bed. Julian squeezed his eyes shut. It was over. They would be seen now. 40 gaunt faces, living people instead of a pile of rags. A machine gun burst would shred them in this confined space. Julian lowered his hand and covered Tommy's fist with his own. He felt the hard bread beads. He prayed silently, screaming with his soul to the Holy Mother. You stop the boot. Close their eyes. The beam swept the interior. It slid over faces, shoulders, shaved heads. The SS officer stood half a meter away. He saw them. He couldn't not see them, but he was silent. 1 second. 2. 3. Then the SS officer suddenly recoiled back, as if punched in the face. He covered his nose with his greatcoat sleeve, a sound like a suppressed gag reflex. He screamed, "Mein Gott! What is that stench?" He coughed, waving his free hand as if shooing a swarm of flies. He yelled to close it immediately. Julian opened his eyes. He didn't understand. The truck bed smelled of roses. The scent was so thick and sweet, it made heads spin. It was the aroma of the Garden of Eden. Why did the SS officer act like he stuck his nose in a cesspool? Another soldier ran up and hastily threw the tarp down, also wrinkling his nose. He commented that it smelled like corpses left in the heat for a week, fastening straps with such speed as if afraid to catch infection through the air. The SS officer, still coughing and wiping watering eyes, waved the flashlight toward the barrier. He croaked at Vogel to get out, to take that filth away, fast. Vogel replied calmly that he told him so. But Julian heard the clutch tremble as the officer pressed the pedal. Typhus has its own smell. The engine roared, the truck jerked and lunged forward, gaining speed. They passed under the raised barrier. The bridge over the Oder was behind them. Silence hung in the truck darkness again. But now it was different. Light. Tommy whispered, asking why he screamed about the stench when it smelled of flowers. Julian smiled in the dark, tears running down his dirty cheeks. He understood. For them, for those who believed, the bread rosary exuded the scent of grace. For those whose hearts were full of hate, the same source was unbearable. Light blinds those used to darkness. Fragrance for some became stench for others. Julian whispered that it was protection, a cloak. The truck sped through the night, carrying them further from the barbed wire, leaving behind the camp that would turn to ash in 3 days. But they were already far away, wrapped in the scent of roses, and an invisible shield that even an SS searchlight couldn't pierce. Chicago, Illinois, October 1985. The wind off Lake Michigan was cold, but it smelled of rain and fallen leaves, not death. In an old cemetery under the canopy of a huge oak stood 2 men. One leaned on a cane. He was 73. His hands, once the strong hands of a carpenter, now trembled with age, but the same quiet, stubborn light still burned in his eyes. It was Julian. Next to him stood a younger man, about 60, tall, with white hair and the kind face of a grandfather who spoils grandkids with candy. Tommy. The very boy who was supposed to die that winter night in '44. He survived. He became an engineer. He built bridges, raised 3 sons and 5 grandchildren. 5 new lives that wouldn't exist if not for a handful of breadcrumbs. They stood before a modest gray granite tombstone. It was an empty grave, a cenotaph. The body of the man whose name was carved on the stone lay somewhere in a mass pit near Berlin, lost in the chaos of the war's final days. But here, on American soil, he had a name. The inscription read, Hans Vogel, 1910-1944. Love covers a multitude of sins. Tommy adjusted his coat. He said quietly that he received a letter from the Munich archives last week. Confirmed. He was executed 2 days after their escape for negligence and loss of prisoners. He didn't tell them the truth. He didn't give up the route. Julian nodded. He knew. He always knew. He said Vogel bought them time. He paid for their lives with his own. Julian took a small object wrapped in velvet cloth from his coat pocket. He unwrapped it. The bread rosary. 40 years had passed. The bread, mixed with dirt and saliva, had long since petrified. The beads became black, hard as obsidian. They survived the ocean, survived decades, survived their creators. The cross was slightly bent, a memory of how Tommy gripped it that night in the truck. Julian brought the beads to his face. He closed his eyes and inhaled. It was incredible. Even here, in the wind, amidst the smells of the autumn city and highway exhaust. The rosary smelled, faint but distinct delicate aroma, yellow tea roses. Tommy whispered, looking at the relic with tears in his eyes, that they still smelled. Science said it was impossible. Bread should have rotted or crumbled to dust. The smell should have faded in a week. Julian smiled. He said, "Science doesn't know everything. Love doesn't rot. Sacrifice has no expiration date." He placed the petrified rosary on the cold granite of the tombstone, just for a minute, like a greeting, like a witness. They stood in silence. The carpenter from Ohio and the boy from Iowa come to honor the memory of a Wehrmacht officer. Enemies turned brothers by a miracle. The story of Julian and Vogel teaches us one simple truth. Even when the whole world turns into a meat grinder, even when it seems there is no God, only hunger and cold, even then we have a choice. We can eat our bread alone and die full for 1 hour, or we can turn that bread into hope for another. Julian didn't feed Tommy's body with that bread, but he saved his soul, and the saved soul saved them all. The wind died down. A ray of sun broke through the clouds, illuminating the black bread cross on the gray stone, and for a moment, just for a second, it seemed to the whole cemetery that summer had come to Chicago. This story reminds us that darkness, no matter how thick, cannot extinguish even the smallest candle. Light always finds a way, sometimes through a temple window, sometimes through the dirty window of a camp barracks, and sometimes through a stale piece of bread in the hand of an enemy. In a world full of bad news, this place is our little island of hope. If you want to hear more stories like this, click the subscribe button and become part of our community. And remember, miracles don't just happen in the past. They happen wherever people believe in them. Thank you for being with us today.